and the environment that I was in, nobody really put any precedent. Your circle is relatively small, then that's what you aspire to, and that's your life. The reality was that I often did the thing that was in front of my nose. So if those things were bad things, then I would do them. And to be fair, I think so much of my opportunity was pure luck and timing. So you might not bring the same things other groups have. You might not have the swanky kind of careers and job titles, but you have your character and you have your integrity. I think that sometimes people spend more time preferring to be right than to be effective. It's a very simple concept, DNA. I always say it's beautifully simple. The challenge is to get people to work in a way that is different from their preference. If you can't do that, you won't change a thing.
Welcome to another episode of The Leadership. And one of the things I said about this podcast was I want to highlight the amazing people who you don't get to hear a lot from. People who have done work behind the scenes for years. And you'll have felt that impact, but you won't necessarily have known or recognized that it was them. And my guest today is one of those people that is going to come on shortly and introduce himself. And in fact, before I carry on, let me see what he says. Can you introduce yourself without giving me your name? Your name comes last. Tell me who you are, what you do, what you stand for, and then you can give that your name.
Okay, so this is quite a difficult one. Can I just do with my name? Let me do that.
I'll take it easy. You go for it. I'll take it easy.
I'll go for the easy ones first. So my name will be So I'm currently the group director for diversity, inclusion, and wellbeing at Sky. Responsible for primarily their work tackling racial inequity. And also responsible for the £30 million of funding that Sky's put together to make that happen. My career has spanned over 20 years, so getting on a bit now, but worked in a variety of roles globally with business, including people like Live Nation and Ticketmaster, but also worked within government in regeneration and housing, and started my career at an organisation called the Commission for Racial Equality, which was established to tackle discrimination, promote equality of opportunity, and promote good relations. So quite a varied career journey, and my name is David Carrigan.
Easy, just flows. And one of the things that really struck me about when I started to read more about you and your background, like you said, 20 plus years of career, doing amazing things in different, both private and public sector. And you were the first member of your family to complete your secondary school education.
Yeah, I mean, my background was quite modest. So I went, you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from Birmingham. So come from inner city Birmingham, went to lots of different schools, and my parents had quite modest careers. So, my mum worked with social services initially, then ended up working as a cleaner as she got a little bit older. And my dad was a great bloke, but he worked on the buses, which was, a job that he absolutely loved, and then worked in a factory doing things like night shifts. So they were out quite a lot. They worked lots of jobs, and the focus on education wasn't really there because, one, that they'd never benefited from the education themselves. So that obviously affects their aspirations of the importance of education. And the environment that I was in, nobody really put any precedent on things like O-levels and GCSEs. You just kind of went to school, endured it, got a job. And then if you got a job, then things were pretty rosy. So when I left school, I was actually a gas engineer. So I did an apprenticeship as a gas engineer. So that was my first formal job. And then just by chance of meeting someone who was going to a university, which I'd never heard of, got exposed to that world. So did night school and did A-levels at night school and eventually went to university. So yeah, the first in a lot of areas within the family to do those things. And, that's not because there's anything special about me. It's just the choices that people have to make given the cards they're dealt with. And also, I think a lot of it is about awareness that there is different things out there. So if your circle is relatively small, then that's what you aspire to, and that's your life. And I think if you get exposure to other things, then you start to kind of think, maybe I could do something differently. So nothing special, just, a lot of different circumstances that came together to help me.
Then there are times when we don't always get to pick our circumstances, but we do get to pick our choices in regards to the circumstances. Now, you've been exposed to someone who that gave you that insight into like university education, and you're like, what is that? You start to look into that. Coming from, like I said, the environment that you did and then moving into that, that's still a massive transition because you don't necessarily have that support around you. So was there a level of self-awareness and mentality that was like, I can do this or I can't do this, that was there real for you at that point in time?
I'd like to say that it was as intentional as that. I think the reality was that I often did the thing that was in front of my nose. So if those things were bad things, then I would do them. And to be fair, there were lots of things that I did as a young person that probably weren't the right direction. But it wasn't intentional. It was just that was in front of my nose, and that's what I did. So I was in an environment where some of the people I started to hang out with were doing more productive things with their lives. So went that way, but it was just as easy for me to have gone the other. So I think the only conscious choices that I had were the values that my parents gave me around, not stealing was a big thing for them. Sounds quite basic, but, trust me, the environment I was in, everything was stolen. So that was quite an important red line for them. And being honest as well. So there was nothing intentional. I purely, and I know that a lot of people argue against it, I think so much of my opportunity was pure luck and timing, seriously. I'd love to say I was intentional. I decided I wanted to change my environment. I didn't think my environment was that bad at all. I thought my environment was good, and it was in many respects. But I had no desire to leave that. It was just the fact that every time I kind of put my head above another fence, I went, oh, that looks okay. Then another fence, oh, that looks okay. And then, and that's how my whole life has unfolded, really.
So your thought is you fed your curiosity then. You were looking. There are people who have their heads down and they're not looking above the fence and they can't see what's in front of them. But you seem to have that. I'm going to look above. There's something there. Let me go for it. And that was quite fundamental for you. And you said something around luck, which I always find interesting, especially with successful people. How do you make your own luck in the fact that you are curious, you are open, and therefore you're inviting that in? Or do you just believe that it's just a random coincidence of events that happen?
I mean, I'm not going to say that the reason I'm sitting here today is just because of luck and nothing to do with hard work. I mean, I work bloody hard, but I think what I did realise quite earlier on was that curiosity to look at different things was really important. I did have a curiosity, and I think because my formal education at school was so poor, I left thinking, I was stupid and I couldn't do this and that. And actually the education journey I went on gave me the confidence, and it is often about the confidence to walk into a space that you don't feel is inclusive for you, to have a conversation with someone about something you don't know about, to be able to put yourself in that position, to be curious, does require a level of confidence, because you're by definition insecure when you're in an environment that you don't feel comfortable in. And I think that you have to have an element of confidence in what you bring. So you might not bring the same things other groups have. You might not have the swanky kind of careers and job titles, but you have your character and you have your integrity. And those are really important commodities that give you the confidence to go into a space and know your worth. So for me, I think that the natural curiosity is really important. You've got to put yourself in a position to do that. But you also need to gear yourself up for the discomfort that you're going to feel when you start looking over a fence, because you're not always going to see things that you think, oh, that's me. Never works out like that. And I've spent 20 odd years in a career and I still go through that every single day. When I walk into an office like Sky that's all super swanky, or I get invited to kind of an event and there's politicians there, or, speak on a podcast with people like these aren't things that are in my honey zone. I've learned to adapt to them and feel comfortable in them. But, would I say this is what the sort of thing I'd do every day? Absolutely not. But you need to be in a position to kind of influence and have those conversations. If that makes sense.
It does. It makes effort. I think it's also quite human and great to actually hear that, like you said, 20 plus years, you're still navigating and you're still stepping into uncomfortable situations, and it's not always easy. You can easily think that, oh, after a couple of years, whatever I'm doing, I'm going to be all right. It's like, no, anything new, it's always going to have that feeling of, oh, this feels uncomfortable because it's brand new, regardless of how many years you've been doing stuff. And hearing someone like you say that, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think you have to be human about these things, and I think what's difficult with any leader is to have the confidence to be vulnerable enough to say you don't always have the answers. I mean, every person I speak to at various levels of a business will have those feelings. The question is, they're just not always open about them. But unless you're kind of a sociopath that thinks everything you do is absolutely amazing, or you're not self-critical, and I think most people who are effective have an element of self-criticism. You know, the balance is to make sure that you don't criticize yourself to the point where you feel that you can't do anything. But you know, I'm sure anyone listening, they will have that ability to go and look at what they've done with a critical arm and go, you know, I wish I'd done that differently, or I wish I'd had that conversation, or I wish I'd made that choice. That is perfectly normal. It happens no matter how successful you are in your career. The question is to get that balance right, because you want your self-critical evaluation of yourself to be the superpower that improves you. It gives you the ability to learn from the things that don't go well, and to be able to kind of make sure you make better decisions in the future. But you've also got to accept that if you do anything that's innovative or creative, or you're shaking a tree because you're trying to achieve change, not everything will work out. There will be things that go very badly wrong, and it's being able to accept that without it destroying your confidence. But if you don't worry about things going wrong and you're arrogant, then that makes you equally susceptible to problems in the future. So it's just that healthy balance that I think we're all striving to have, and I don't think we ever have it totally. Sometimes we have it for a few months, other times it will evaporate as quickly as it appears. So again, just be a bit human about it. You know, cut yourself a bit of slack.
I'm curious. I know you said you weren't intentional around your career path, but you went into an area in the field to do with like race relations. And I'm thinking back like 20 plus years ago, that was a whole different environment. That was like one of the hardest areas and sectors to go into. And that's where you ended up. And obviously your career's been amazing. You've been able to do some amazing things there. But I'm like, of all the things to go into, why pick one of the hardest areas?
Yeah, I mean, it was very different. I mean, you talk about it, we're talking in the 90s. And, you know, Stephen Lawrence and the kind of the murder of Stephen Lawrence was topical, but was just going to be another case of a young black kid getting murdered and, you know, people getting away with it. That was the expectation. Workplaces, I mean, even my own experience, I mean, I'm kind of mixed race, and I think that I can't even talk about some of the examples. I mean, it's probably less prevalent now because of my loss of hair, but, you know, walking around with a big afro in a very different work environment, the things that were tolerated, and I tolerated them, to be honest, and everyone, it was just the way things were, was a very different society. So, you know, people talked openly about racism, and people talked about discrimination, and it was acknowledged, it wasn't glossed over. And I think over the past few years, we've seen massive gains. You know, we've seen massive changes in society. The way that race is talked about, people's willingness to connect and discuss the issue. But in some cases, people have felt less comfortable talking about things like racism. It still happens. The stats haven't moved hugely, but there's sometimes a reluctance to kind of revisit that, almost like you're going back and not focusing on all the positives that have happened. You know, of course, there've been massive changes. I don't think anyone would doubt that. But there are still some things that are persistent. And, you know, it's really important that we don't ignore those things, because they are important systemic issues. You know, exclusion of kids from school, experience of the black community within health, housing, education, employment. Think about every single social indicator you can think of. there is often a disparity, and we can all debate and argue why those disparities exist, but they exist nonetheless. So it's important to understand what is driving those things, and sometimes those conversations seem to be less prevalent than personally I would like to see.
In all that you have done so far, I guess I'm interested to hear about what are some of the challenges that you've had working both in the public sector, working with the government, and then working in the private sector. What are some of the challenges that you had when it comes to having conversations around diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity?
I think each organisation is different personalities, different culture, and the kind of things those organisations do, whether they're commercial or government, it doesn't really matter. But I think the biggest challenge is that when you work in this space, if you do it effectively, you are essentially shaking a tree. You're going in to look at what isn't working well, having to encourage people to have a conversation about an issue that, one, they may not have any personal experience in, or in some cases not be aware that there is a particular problem or nuance that they're not exposed to. And then you're asking people to work in a way that is not always their preference in order to address those things. So when you look at those things in totality, the challenge is always a very difficult one. It's always something you have to face into, and you need the resilience to be able to have those conversations, because if you shirk the difficult conversations, then you achieve very little. So I think it's that is a challenge no matter what sector that you're in. But what I always say is it's important to listen and observe. Sometimes you'll go in and you'll see an area that doesn't seem to be working particularly well, or there are disparities in data or people's experience. And you can go in, and I did this very much in my early careers, walk in, think I was the bee's knees, and look at something and go, that's broke. Why hasn't anyone fixed it? And then the genius that I was, go in with 2 feet saying, oh, we need to do this and that, and address it. And what I learned is that if you go into an organisation and you see something that appears broke, that appears to be low-hanging fruit, and someone hasn't picked it, there's a bloody good reason why they haven't picked it. And actually, it's the environment, the politics, and those things that often create the dynamics that prevent even the simplest things of being fixed. So part of the challenge is to be able to work at the pace that the organisation is able to tolerate, and to bring the greatest group of people along with you on that journey, because all of the changes need to get broad support, broad appeal. You need to persuade people of the merits of the different approach and why you're fixing that issue in that way. It's very easy to point and shout, but that doesn't change things. It's about persuading people on a moral, on an emotional, and on an intellectual level that these changes are the right things for that organisation. So I think that challenge is one that, you have to, cut your cloth accordingly. You have to tailor how you communicate, how you work with those groups. It's a very simple concept, D&I. I always say it's beautifully simple. The challenge is to get people to work in a way that is different from their preference. If you can't do that, you won't change a thing. But as a problem, it's a very simple one. It's just the mechanics of getting people to work in that way.
Well, just people know, so like, why should I have to do that? Why should I have to spend time convincing people when the data's there, the research is there, the moral standpoint and argument is there? Like, shouldn't they just get this and understand it, and we should just focus on actually doing the work, not have to spend so much time trying to get them to understand?
I don't know. I think one of the things that, and these are my personal views on the work that I do. So I think that sometimes people spend more time preferring to be right than to be effective. And in order to be effective, then you have to sometimes have the conversations that are frustrating. But if you're trying to get people to change and to do things differently, I think there is a big difference between being committed in this space, saying the right things, but actually it's the actions that are more important. And to get people to change and not work in a way that is their preference is going to be challenging. So that issue of persuasion is really important. I think any successful rights movement, and I'm talking in society now, not within businesses, but if you look at rights that have been gained for kind of sex equality, race equality, sexual orientation, all of those rights have been driven by persuasion. I think people have appealed to people's moral and also their sensibilities about, Martin Luther King, we talked about this before, that Martin Luther King appealed to people as rights for Black African Americans as American rights. I think it was quite obvious when you've seen brown paper bags nailed on churches and people being refused entry because they don't match the colour of the bag, that it's relatively a simple concept to understand. But in order to change people's approach and to get them to be part of a solution, you need to persuade people of the merits and why that is important. And I think you've seen it more recently with, the kind of opportunities for, same-sex marriage and protection in law for kind of gay, lesbian, bisexual people in law, because the reality has been that you've persuaded people. That wasn't driven by the 5% of people who identify as, gay, lesbian, or bisexual in the society. It was driven because the other 95% went, why can't people get married, and why can't they have rights to property when someone's died, and why can't they have protection in law? And it's the same for all of these areas. It's about the persuasion. So it is massively frustrating, massively frustrating sometimes that you can have the same conversations, but in order to be effective, they're just things that you just have to do. So, I think that's the focus, is what is effective, a way of changing the narrative around that.
How do you as a leader keep on expanding your knowledge and your understanding of the topics that you're involved in? I mean, when I look at your prior role with that nation, which is working across 40 international markets, for example, that's a massive amount of cultures to be able to get your head around, to kind of implement. So how do you kind of keep on learning and growing and developing?
I think that's a bit back to the previous question about being curious, looking over a fence. I think that there's that saying that I love, the more I learn, the less I know. And it's that awareness that there is always more to understand. And I think you have to have that natural curiosity and fascination. So all I do in my area is speak to as many people as possible. I know the areas that I feel more comfortable in. There are also areas that I think my knowledge needs to develop, where I do have those conversations. So that's really important. I think also the work that I do is about partnership. So, going into, I looked at my career. I worked as a specialist in race discrimination and the CRE. Then I went into housing and regeneration, didn't have a clue about housing and regeneration, was not aware of issues around gender, particularly areas of disability, all of the stuff around social economic disadvantage. I didn't have a clue about that. But by working in partnership with people that did, that's how you build your knowledge and your skill set. So, I'm a bit of a nerd like that. I love learning. I absolutely like a sponge for learning from different people. And I think going from different sector, you go in with a humility that your stuff on D&I. But what I don't know is what I have to do in a media and entertainment business, or what I do within the music industry. I don't know. I've never put a show together. I don't know how to develop a program for content. So I have to work with people that do. And that's, I think, the magic of doing this work well, that there is no playbook. You can't just bring in some deck that's been used around, this is unconscious bias and this is what we do around raising awareness and this is our leader. It's the mechanics are exactly the same. It's just you have to adapt them to the business. And I think that has given me, and I think this is why I love my job, that I've learned so much from just working with some amazing, different, brilliant people in all of those sectors. So I think when it comes down to how do you keep fresh, it's just exposing yourself. And what I do, a personal thing, is I expose myself to arguments I can't stand. So I think one of the things that is probably one of the few strengths I have in this space is to be able to speak to someone I disagree with, and disagree with them on a subject that I absolutely get lit up on, but to disagree well, because I've learned as much from speaking to someone whose views I ordinarily would not be inclined to listen to, as I would be speaking to someone I agree with. And I think that's a real strength, but also I see that in society as something we've lost as a society, the ability to disagree well.
How do you disagree well? Because that's, like I said, that's tough. Like especially when you know that subject matter and you're hearing someone give you a contrarian view, being able to stay calm and not get annoyed or frustrated or lash out, which is what we see a lot of times, especially played out on social media platforms. Like, how do you disagree well?
Part of it is to understand the position that someone is started from. So, when I worked in cohesion in government, we were working with essentially two polarised sides. So you've got far right groups, so British National Party, and people are sympathetic to that. On the other side, we had Islamist groups who had a fundamental, completely different polarised view about the world. So you've got these two groups, and what you've got to do is try and create the conditions where you reduce that prejudice. And it's called contact theory, and it's something that I absolutely obsess with. But I think it comes to the heart of disagreeing well. And there are 4 conditions to contact theory that really are, I think, fundamentals in anything that you do in this space. So the first condition is that people share intimate beliefs. So that includes beliefs that you might not agree with, their perceptions that you might be offended by. And that is really important, because unless you can get to the crux of why people think the way that they do and why they believe the things that they do, you can't ever have a conversation. And sometimes people don't share those beliefs because there is a fear that those beliefs will have some level of detriment to you. Certainly in the workplace, people aren't very open because it can get you fired. Let's be honest. We see this increasingly in society with what they call this cancel culture. But being able to share the beliefs is the first part. The second is that you have equal status. And this is the really difficult one, because it sounds quite easy that everybody talking has equal status. But in many cases, conversations around D&I, you don't have equal status. So if you are talking about sex discrimination and you are a woman who has experienced sex discrimination, for a man to have a view that is seen as equal to talk about the experience of sex discrimination in that space, there's always an imbalance, starting a conversation with, actually, as someone who was an ethnic minority, I find what you said as a white man offensive. That's essentially changed the dynamics around status, and actually it's the most difficult one of those 4 conditions. But if you can meet those and actually go into those conversations with that equal status, then that helps. And then you've got spirit of cooperation. So you're cooperating towards a shared means or end. So it could be in an environment trying to create a decent community. In work, it could be an inclusive culture. And then the final one, the final 4th one, is being sanctioned by a higher authority. And by that, I don't mean God, but someone who has authority over that environment. So it could be your employer, or it could be the local authority and all the community organisations. But if you meet those 4 dynamics, you will undoubtedly reduce prejudice. And in order to do that, you need to be able to disagree well. So understand the perspective. Say, I agree to disagree, but actually have a conversation about why people feel that way. And often you'll find that if someone has a prejudicial view, or one that is blatantly discriminatory or very negative, that the arguments for why they hold that view will fall away. And actually, on an intellectual level, you can really unpack that. So I think that disagreeing well is really important. Does that answer your question? Quite a long...
No, but it's a practical.
I'm giving very long answers, but these are quite complicated things. You can give a buzzword, but what I'm trying to do is just illustrate.
Just delve into it.
Yeah, to delve into it.
And that's where the difference is. I think there's so many things that are done or are said on a very surface level that make it seem so simplistic, but actually isn't. It's complex, and therefore it needs to be unraveled, or you have like that 4-step right, process that you just kind of delivered, which makes, okay, now that I can see, I can logically walk through that and I can apply that. And that's like, those are the things I want to hear, because that's where the experience comes from. As opposed to someone who's like, yeah, I just read something and this is what it is. Like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. But listening to the application and how you're kind of breaking it down for me is really, really good and really, really helpful. And something that you said to me earlier that kind of stayed out to me, when you're talking about you moving into a role and yeah, you need the United side of things, but you necessarily know the other things, whether it's like housing or even like entertainment and all of that. And if I'm looking at you like, David, you navigated to some great organizations, you are in a senior leadership position. Apart from working hard and apart from luck, what advice would you offer someone who's like, I want to get to where you kind of got to and rise to those echelons in organization?
I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of a shorter answer for you on this one.
Doesn't have to be short. Bring it.
What has helped me is to become a subject matter expert. And I think that I'm very conscious that, I have kind of, if we look at the D&I kind of spectrum, I've got multiple kind of characteristics that would fall into lots of boxes. I'm very conscious that I think to be successful, well, no, not to be successful, I think to be effective, I think I use that term, to be effective, you need to develop your expertise as a subject matter expert, not based on your lived experience, but based on your expertise. And I think that there is a very big difference between what I would consider to be insight gain from my background and very different from what I would do in a professional environment and how you advise companies. And I think lived experience doesn't give you the ability to shape a D&I agenda. And I think that's quite a challenging statement to make. But I always use the analogy that I'm talking to you now through a laptop and a computer. I use a computer every single day. You would not put me in charge of IT infrastructure within a business. Now, I've got lived experience of it, and I know it might be quite controversial, but this is my personal view on that. And I think with D&I, that the single biggest challenge, but I think thing that makes a big difference is to be fiercely objective when the thing that you are looking at, you care about, or is about you. So there are some areas that I am very mindful that I have a very personal kind of affiliation towards, and I am very mindful of managing that to make sure that I don't over-index on the thing that I care about, and also with people that I work with in my team, that we're all aware of those kind of honey spots for us all. And to be effective, you have to be able to be super, super objective, and that's really difficult. And that's why, some roles have not been for me in the past, because I would find it impossible to be objective in some environments with some issues that come up around D&I and inclusion. I just know, and I think that that's probably a really important commodity I see with lots of people in this profession. And then the balance to be an advocate rather than an activist. And again, that is not about saying that people who have an activist mentality are doing things wrong. That's got nothing to do with what I'm saying at all. I think activists, and I was an activist in very much the earlier parts of my career, but to be an advocate to change is a very different approach. And it is about how do you get from A to B. And it's very easy to say what the challenges are. It's very easy to say where you want to be. There are people who are much more eloquent at me at painting the picture of what a great inclusive organisation is. And it's really easy to say, well, what the challenge is or what we need to do is, and you point all the problems out. I see the role of good people in this profession to operate in the grey area. And I think that is the challenge, is getting people to accept the problems, which in some cases most people do. The world as work has changed. People accept problems like this constantly now. It's not the same conversation we had 10 years ago, but the disagreement always comes from the point of how do you get to the outcome, because everyone wants the same outcome as well. And most people are, it's indisputable, they want more inclusive environment, more inclusive cultures, but it's how you get there. That's where the disagreement goes, and then that's where the skill set. So I would say to anyone who wants to get into this area or wants to, in my view, have an impactful career is to constantly build your relationships with people who are subject matter experts in their area, build your own capability, and to constantly work in partnership and collaborate. That is, I think, the recipe that makes things work in practice. Not from a strategic level, because that's relatively straightforward. From an operational, how do things work? How do the nuts and bolts work in this business? How do I get this to happen here? You can't do that by sitting on the top of a hill, pontificating to the masses. You need to get your hands dirty.
Was there a particular experience, or was there something that happened that caused you to shift from an activist to advocate?
I think that what happened for me was a realization that, I always wanted to affect change. I always wanted to be impactful. I didn't want to window dress. I didn't want to kind of, DNA is in everything we do, and it's, like golden threads and blah, 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 blah. And I didn't want to be someone that worked in that way. And when I left the Commission for Racial Equality, I was very much in that mold of, right, we're going to pull the walls down. We're going to kind of expose all of these issues, and we're going to tackle them all head on. And the Commission, as an organisation that focused on race and equality and racism, it was very easy because that's what its raison d'etre was. That was all it was set up to do. So that was part of how it operated. When you work in different organisations, the work around equality is massively important, but it's not everything they were set up to do. So you do have to work with different stakeholders and different organisations. In housing, there are 19 separate housing organisations that all do things differently. They're worth billions of pounds. You can't just go out into that sector and say, you must do this, this and this, because you don't have the levers. And it's very easy to be irrelevant in those conversations. So for me, transitioning from the Commission into housing was a really rude awakening, because what I was doing was being morally right, but not being effective, burning bridges, because what I was advocating for was the right thing to do, but I had no levers. I had no legal levers. The Commission could do formal investigation. I could just hit you with a stick. In an environment where you don't have that stick, you need a different tactic. And I think that the outcomes that I've achieved subsequently are probably more impactful, but they've been more complex because they've had to work with different people. So I think that lesson, but when I retire, I'll be straight back on the top of my hill, screaming for the walls to be pulled down. But I can say with hand on heart that doing this in an authentic way gives me a lot of satisfaction. So that was the penny drop moment. It's quite a difficult one. I found it personally really, really challenging. I had a formula I thought worked, then I found that it didn't work, and I ran the risk of just becoming irrelevant in that organisation. So I had a lot of people help me to navigate my emotions in that, and realise that it was the tactic, not the outcome or the means, that was the issue. So I just had to maybe, temper my approach in the right way, without losing the sense of what I was trying to achieve.
It's just like how you say that. It takes me back to something I read way back around Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And part of obviously, there was a lot of objections in the Black community, in particular, around some of the changes that they made and some of the language and nuances. And one thing that Martin Luther King said was, if we need to be effective, we can't have the same tirade over and over again. We need to be able to adapt to still get us to where we want to get to, but work in the realm of what we're currently operating in. And I think that's something that's easily lost sometimes, that actually everything that we do is an evolution. And you don't necessarily lose your end goal, but there are different ways of being impactful. You can't just apply the same thing over and over and over again in every single environment think it's going to work. You have to be able to adapt to that environment and keep your authenticity and keep that long-term vision that you're trying to influence and impact.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's an either or. I think there is a real temptation, and it is seductive that you can go into a room of whatever audience, and you can kind of give the rallying call. We're not going to put up with this. We see this every day. And you literally get your standing ovation, and you will come out of there with people feeling really empowered and really passionate. And then what? And I think that in too many examples of that, I've seen people who offer that, but also another way of looking at solving the problem, not, get told that they're selling out or they're less committed or, all of these negative things. And I think actually it's important for us to look at what is effective, what has affected change, look at other movements that have been effective, what is it that they've done.
And I was going to ask you around, told you're someone who enjoys a good book or a good film. And I'm curious, what are your top 3 films and top 3 books?
I know they're going to say I'm not particularly sophisticated, but I love coming to America. I just, I can act it. I can do the voices, the full night. So yeah, I didn't like it. I couldn't watch it. It was a bit too, just a bit sanitized. I loved the first one, so I did love that. God, so many. I mean, I'm trying to think. I really loved Schindler's List. I did like that film. I thought that was brilliant. Only watched it a few times, but I'm not massive into loads and loads of movies, but no, I did watch that film, and that was one that was, really resonated, and I thought it was beautifully shot as well. I thought the story, the characters were great. Ralph Fiennes was just awesome in that film, and I think the fact that it was shot in black and white as well was particularly powerful. And books, this is where I think there's a book called Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks, which is a really good. I mean, as a young person, I wasn't very good at reading, so I used to really struggle with standing up in class. So I had a real issue with books, and then when I started going to night school, I became a sponge. So read quite a lot. So I thought that book is good. It's a really beautifully written book. I think it won a few awards as well. But it's taken during the war, and it's not the sort of story I'd pick up, but I got recommended it, so I thought that was really good. There's a book that I really enjoy at the moment, but recently it's a guy called Jonathan Haidt. I think he's a social psychologist or something, and it's called The Coddling of the American Mind, and it's controversially takes on the issue of kind of the new generation of people and cancel culture and all of those things, and covers things like microaggressions, and it's a book that I don't agree with all of the arguments in it, but it was really thought provoking, so I did enjoy that. I did enjoy that book. And then as far as, I mean, there's so many things. I'm looking behind me, there's tons of ones that I mean, I would say for fun, I enjoyed, there's a book called Sapiens. It's quite well known, and it's just super cool. I mean, for just as a tube read, I picked it up and I finished it in about a week. It was just really, really interesting. Talks about how kind of society has evolved from kind of people being hunter-gatherers all the way to where we are now. And then there's a follow-up book called, I think it's called Homo Deus, which I think is translated as God-man. And yeah, I'm sure I've probably screwed it up now. So someone who's better at Latin will say, there we go, you idiot. But it talks about the future. So the whole thing about Sapiens was talking about getting to a point where you've got rid of war and disease and food is in abundance. And then the question is, what is next for the future? So it's about things like life extension and the pursuit of happiness has been the key driver, because largely, I know it's ironic because Ukraine's going on, but largely those large wars that we saw kind of in the first part of the Industrial Revolution onwards have been eradicated, health has improved massively, and food abundance and society has evolved hugely. So what is next? So those are the kind of the three ones that stand out that I'd read again, definitely.
Add that to my list, actually. I remember reading well, Seekers is definitely a good one that I've read, but the two that you mentioned, I'm like, okay, I need to expand my reading list.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of a film. I've got my 2 films. So I think the other one, I like documentaries more than films, to be honest. I really love documentaries. So I would say I like, there's one called Fire in Babylon, which is a wicked documentary. It's about the 1980s West Indian team. It's got a brilliant soundtrack to it. And growing up in Birmingham, that team was just, they were the business. So Andy Roberts and, all of those guys were just awesome. So that's a really good documentary, as is kind of When We Were Kings, the Muhammad Ali one, which I love Muhammad Ali. He was one of my idols. But then I heard about the stuff that happened with Joe Frazier. Scratch that one. Yeah, Joe Frazier more than Foreman. I thought, what he did to Smoking Joe wasn't cool at all. And I know Ali's loved by everyone, and I loved him as well. I've got books on him at the back. But when I found out what Joe Frazier offered to do, get him his belt back, provided money for his family, all of that stuff, and then to call him, an Uncle Tom, and it's just not cool. And I think Muhammad, recognised that towards the end of his life, but I don't think Joe ever got over that, even to the very end. And I think that was definitely a bad period. But the documentary When We Were Kings was wicked. I mean, it's got James Brown in it. It's got BB King. It's got some amazing footage. I mean, Ali he looked like an absolute god in that. And that was when he was older. Imagine getting him kind of in the mid-60s, it'd have been even more. But that was a brilliant, brilliant documentary, great soundtrack, and great message.
Do you think that tainted his legacy? Because he was learning, wasn't he? He was a young kid, very brash, and the way he kind of showed up was wrong, and he admitted it alive.
I don't think he taints his legacy at all. I think, Muhammad did some amazing things, and, it's like everything. We are all flawed characters. We all do the capacity to do some great things, but it doesn't make us perfect. And I don't think any of us are. I just think for people like Ali, they're beyond reproach. There's nothing that's ever going to undo all of the remarkable things that they did, not just on a practical level, but also for people's mentality globally. I think you get these global superstars, and he transcended boxing. And it was incredible. But I think there's some elements of everyone's life that probably none of us would only be poured over. None of us would cast the first stone. So, I don't think he taints his legacy at all. But it's just something that was unfortunate because, Joe Frazier was a decent man, was very poor, came from a very poor background, and to be labelled as some of the things he was labelled as. I know it was promotion, but I think there's a line sometimes, and I think in those periods in history, shouldn't be calling him a gorilla. I don't think that's cool. But that's it's easy for me to say in hindsight, not in the middle of all that.
Are there role models that you've had over your career, or you still have now, that you've kind of looked up to, that have inspired you or pushed you forward?
I mean, there's a couple. I mean, when I was first at the CRE, there was a guy called Andrew Housley, who was a director, and he'd worked in this space for a long time. So he was a massive inspiration because, by the time I got to meet him, he'd been kind of working in this space for 30 odd years. So, he'd never got fatigued. He was always had that fire in his belly. So he was really inspirational. People like Paul Riddell. I mean, these names no one will have heard of, but they had massive impacts in the fight against racism and discrimination. Paul Riddell worked in London, been a Jamaican guy, super cool, super bright, super tenacious, and I just idolised him. Actually, if he ever hears this, he'll never know. I would never say that, but I just thought the guy was just everything that I wanted to be. And he led the formal investigations of the police for the CRE, and was brilliant. So I think there are people like that in my career, but I'm surrounded constantly by people like yourself, people linked to the BEO, people linked to the DAC at Sky, people I really admire. I think it's such. I don't know. I think whenever you're working in this space, it's really important to kind of not feel that you're on your own doing it. And what we don't do enough of is creating opportunities for like-minded people to come together and actually really talk. I think there's a lot of things that prevent us from doing that, but that's almost the kind of the rocket fuel that, if you feel responsible for this area, if you feel that you want to make a change, it's really easy to feel though the rucksack is full of rocks, and what you want to be is in a position where you feel that it's the rocket fuel. There's a rocket pack on your back, not a rucksack full of rocks. And I think sometimes you get that from being around people that inspire you. And I think we can all point to those individuals. What we don't do, I don't think, is bring enough of us together regularly enough to keep that fire burning.
It's a good point, though. It's interesting. Last night I listened to an interview with Teresa Mallory in the US. And she was talking about an incident that happened where the woman was, but the woman basically, like, something happened with her child. She went to the next woman's door and she got shot through the door and she got killed. And Teresa Mallory and like 15 other, like, let's call them activists and those in the political sphere just literally jumped on a call and had a conversation, right? This is what we're going to do and move forward. And she was talking about how often they all meet and just connect and just talk in a very closed door sessions. I remember thinking about that last night, like, that was so dope if we did something like that in the UK. We just got voices together, whether it's in a room, on a Zoom call, whatever it is, and just had a conversation and just leaned into each other, learned from each other, and really created that space. Because like you said, a lot of times it can be a heavy burden and it's not always easy. But to have that space and collective wisdom and collective nurturing, should I call it, would be, you really got me thinking about that. That'd be really amazing, actually.
Yeah, I think the thing that's special about it is, like you said, that thing about collective wisdom. There are people that were doing this a lot longer than us. That we've talked about this before. That you can see almost a playbook about how things end. You get an issue, you get a moment in history, everybody gets galvanized around it, everyone focuses on it, then other things come into the mix and then it becomes less of a priority. And there have been these touch points throughout history, particularly in the UK, and it's utilising that kind of muscle memory of what people have done in the past and learning from the past. It's one of the oldest sayings, isn't it? If you don't learn from the past, then you can't change your future. And I think there's a lot that we could do as a community to bring in some of the voices that have probably lost their volume over the years. And some of that may be that people are just genuinely fatigued. And, I've seen that, which is a terrible shame when there've been great people that have just tapped out. They're like, you know what? I can't be doing with this anymore. I can't be doing with the infighting. I can't be doing with the politics. I can't be and that's a terrible shame that the journey has almost fatigued them, and we've lost that learning and that expertise and insight. And I think we can do a little bit more to bring people together to actually, I think, curate that community. And I think when you look at the BEO, there isn't, in my view, that, I think if I was looking at any other community or the issue, there are people I would say, right, these are the prominent spokespeople for this area. I think for issues of racial inequity and discrimination, I don't think we've got those individuals. I think there are lots of really super capable, but there are lots of them. I think sometimes having a focal point for those movements are important. We talked. You could talk about people like, in America. I mean, it's very easy to talk in America because they're obviously profile. UK is, the UK has its own issues. We don't need to appropriate the experience of people in America. We've got our own issues here. But I think finding those individuals who are in the UK, I think is really, really important. And I think there's a lot of really good candidates, but they have to want to step forward. And when they step forward, everybody has to be in a position to support and protect them, because they're going to be shaking a tree and there are going to be a lot of apples falling, and we need to make sure that they've got the hard hat that will protect them on the journey. Sope, how about you? Don't tell me you don't like apples.
I like apples, I like bananas, I like pears. No, but I'm 100% aligned to that, actually. I think it's the conversation we had today and before we started this has really got me thinking around the fact that I think what is missing a lot of times is around unison. And when you have so many different, when you have a spread that's not focused, it's a lot harder to have impact. And actually being able to bring all that together in a very focused way will be really, really important. And it'll be like a tip of the spear kind of impact. And that'll be absolutely amazing. And as a part of me is like, yeah, but is that possible? You got egos, you got all that kind of stuff. I'm like, actually, the reality is, it is possible, because we've seen it done time and time again. And without, even then again, but the US is a good example. They do that well, and they can mobilize, and they can come together. And we need our own UK version, because we do have our own issues. We have our own things that are unique to us. And being able to do this in a UK-centered kind of way as a collective group, as well as utilizing spaces like BO or other people and bringing them together, 100% agree with you. I guess it's a move.
Maybe that's a conversation. Maybe that's a conversation to have. To say that, you talked about things like infighting and politics, and that, well, we acknowledge that those things inhibit the ability to kind of identify these kind of vanguard individuals, but we've never really openly talked about it. So, I believe passionately that if there is an individual or individuals that can be the kind of, as you said, the spearhead for this work, they're going to experience people attacking the things that they say and they carry. That's just for any group, that's looking to move rights forward. That's just part of the course, and that's why the issue of resilience is so important. But I think the one thing that is important is that when those challenges come, that the rest of the community support and protect them. And we've seen it with politicians, we've seen it with people who are outspoken and, maybe shake the tree to an extent that people don't like. The first thing they go for is their character, that they're crawled all over. And I think that you have to accept that. But they also need to be protected, because it's bloody lonely. If you're going to be on the front of the ship, sailing through the choppy waters, you want to make sure if you get blown away, that someone's going to grab you and hold you up. And I think that sometimes, Al Sharpton talked about this. He came to the UK, and I went and saw him. I think it was in Hackney. Went to see him, but he talked a lot about stopping the infighting. And the sniping, nothing will be perfect. The BEO is a new organisation, for example. It can't possibly be perfect straight away. But it's really important that an organisation like that survives the choppy waters and actually goes and thrives. And, it doesn't have to be the only organisation, but, there are lots of good community groups, but there needs to be that focal point. And, I'm not an advocate. I'm not involved. I'm not on the PO board, but I'm just looking objectively. 20 years ago, I could point to organisations that were brilliant around challenging systemic discrimination, racism, promoting community kind of dialogue and making better relations. There were lots of them, and they just disappeared in 20 years because of either funding cuts or something else. So there are lots of high-profile organisations, so we need to create them and we need to support them, and that requires everyone a little bit to drop their sword and say that I will support the movement, even though I'm not going to be the face of it. And, in my 20 odd years of experience, I've seen lots of people who cover themselves in the cloak of kind of equality, but only if they're going to be the face of it. And I think that is one of the ongoing challenges for all of the areas of this in this space, not just gender or disability or race or sexual orientation. It's just one of those ongoing challenges, but something that I think we need to face into.
As we wrap up, my last question to you would be, how do you define leadership?
I think the standard answer is leadership is the galvanize people against this common goal. You know what? I do love my quotes because I find them inspiring. I think there's one that I really, really do love, and it was by a guy called Norman Schwarzkopf, Stormin Norman. He was a general in the First Gulf War, and he said a really famous quote, which is that leadership is a combination of strategy and character. So that's leadership. But he also said, if you have to do without one of them, get rid of strategy. And I think that issue of character is the most important quality that, in my experience, any leader has. Leadership isn't about seniority. I think a leader has to inspire. I think most importantly, it's not about senior. I think it is about being able to inspire. And if you can't inspire me, why the hell am I going to follow you? And I can follow you in calm waters, but when it's force 10 and it's choppy and there's a mast that needs to be pulled up and I could get blown overboard, because you're senior, I'm going to go out on that deck. Just because you say the right things, the only people who get me there is people that will inspire me to put myself in a position that I'm not sure about. And I think that when you get challenging times, you see the character of leaders, and I've seen that consistently in all of my career, people who have faced in when it's been really difficult. Michael Rapino at Live Nation's a perfect example. Business that was worth billions of dollars with COVID lost 98% of its revenue overnight. And everyone's wondering what's going to happen in the world. 98% of your revenue, you couldn't make it up overnight. And what he did was he got on a call every single week with all the employees across the business globally and faced into it, told everyone it will be okay, told everyone we don't know when we're going to come out of this, but the business has got strong fundamentals, kept people's spirits up by protecting the employees who were on the lowest salaries, and was completely transparent. But his ability to face into that, when I know that there's no way I'd have been on that call every week, and he did it every single week, telling people where the business was. Even if there was no news, he was always there front and centre. And I'm not a person that easily admires people around leadership, but that was probably the best example. It'll stay with me because we were all in the same boat, and it was amazing to watch how he faced into that. And I'm not saying in any way that he's perfect. I'm sure there's lots of character flaws and things that he's done, but that business did come through and actually is more profitable than it was before COVID. And it was the best example, probably up close, that I've seen leadership inspire, calm fears, and show the way forward, even in the most challenging times. So for me, that's probably the best example that I've seen. So that would be my illustration of character coming through.
Such a great way of looking at what leadership is. Well, a great example as well, actually, because it's like you said, it's being able to inspire and lead from the front and model the right behavior. And I can't imagine being to cope with that. So for you to mobilize in that way, but I guess it speaks to the integrity of the person, and that's what always wins out day in, day out. But speaking about integrity and character. Thank you very much for today. It's been inspirational, very insightful, but for me, I think more importantly, also very educational. And this is what I was talking about at the start, where there are people who have been, like I say, doing this for 20 plus years. There's so much stuff that you know that people don't know, that they haven't seen, that they haven't understood. There's so many nuances and complexities involved in work that you do that it's so easy to be able to cast aspersions and just look at, this is not changing. Like, no, there's a lot more stuff to this. But hearing some of the ways that you've broken things down, the examples you've used, some of the models that you've been able to share, I know people are going to take away and learn so much from this, as I already have. And this is why we need to hear your voice more often. It's why I thought we had to make this happen. So thank you very much for doing this and stepping into the world of podcasting for the first time as well.
Yeah, so hopefully won't be career defining in a negative way. But no, I hope that, I know some of the answers are quite long, but I hope that, it's given some valuable insight. But yeah, you've been very gentle with me. So it's been a pleasurable experience, and just hope that something that I've said, there'll be something in there that lands with someone out there.
There'll be more than one thing. Trust me on that one. But this is Everyday Leadership. We will see you all next week.